Starfield's first major expansion brings to the game something that players have wanted since day one. A focused story in a handcrafted slice of classic Bethesda open world. Beyond that, though, Shattered Space diverts from Starfield's core formula so much that it feels at times like a completely different game. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. Either way, it results in a fascinating journey into the heart of Starfield's most peculiar faction, one which delivers some incredible moments but misses out on several obvious opportunities and makes many strange decisions which feel at odds with the rest of the game. Shattered Space throws the player into the aftermath of a strange experiment at the center of House Va'ruun's capital city, Dazra. As you work with the High Council to fix the mess that someone else made, you're free to explore this unique new world, densely packed with secrets to find, things to collect, and stories to engage with. While it doesn't break away too much from Starfield's usual on-the-ground gameplay loop, Shattered Space does find new ways to make combat interesting and exploration more rewarding. And, without getting into any plot spoilers past the first hour or so, it offers players a self-contained story full of intrigue and drama, even if it doesn't quite live up to its potential in the end.
Member crew have been compromised. Do not repeat, not board.
The story of Shattered Space kicks off when the player grav jumps into the orbit of a random planet and picks up a mysterious transmission from a hideously large and ominous star station called the Oracle. If you choose to ignore the space station and fly elsewhere, on the advice of the voice in the transmission, then the story of Shattered Space is over pretty quickly. But if you choose to dock your ship anyway, then you'll find yourself encountering ghostly Va'ruun soldiers and spectral anomalies, before the whole star station is flung through the cosmos into the orbit of Va'ruun Kai, House Va'ruun's homeworld. Once you've taken your ship down to the planet's surface, landing in the city of Dazra, you will find yourself welcomed into Va'ruun society, and tasked with helping them solve a minor problem. Namely, that most of the city has been sucked into a vortex, leaving a massive crater in its place. From here, you're free to leave the planet if you like, but everything else that Shattered Space has to offer will be found inside this square section of map, including Dazra and its surrounding areas. While there are several locations on Va'ruun Kai that resemble outposts, farms, and research stations you have already seen across the settled systems, most of this map is filled with treacherous terrain and weird Va'ruun architecture, which is unlike that found in any other major settlements. Dazra is like a sort of dark, twisted, occult version of New Atlantis. The whole planet is constantly bathed in a menacing shade of purple, giving Va'ruun Kai an otherworldly atmosphere which represents a pretty huge tonal shift from the settled systems and its NASA punk aesthetic. Even though House Va'ruun's cosmic beliefs are rooted in its founder's grav jump spiritual experience, their culture on Va'ruun Kai feels almost more high fantasy than it does sci-fi. The followers of the Space Snake are isolated survivalists and devoted cultists. Their existence is full of peculiar contrasts which are sometimes interesting and sometimes feel a bit too distant from the rest of Starfield's lore. As an example, a huge colony ship is parked right in the middle of their capital city, and yet House Va'ruun barely seem to acknowledge that space travel exists. But maybe that's mostly because the player need not worry about space travel while on Va'ruun Kai. Not having to travel off-world to finish quests definitely does change the way the game feels, and I'm not sure it's necessarily for the better. The way that I play Starfield, I usually spend a good chunk of time on a single planet before flying off to the next and then taking my time again, rather than jumping between quest markers as I get them. I personally always enjoyed building up my quest log, heading back to my ship to prepare, and flying out into the Starfield. It's one of the key things that sets the game apart from previous Bethesda titles, and it's absent here by design. I do, however, understand that many people grew frustrated with the way that space travel works, and really wanted a planet they could just explore at their leisure with minimal loading screens. And with Shattered Space, you do get that, kind of. There are definitely still lots of loading screens here, and they are still present in places where you'd think they wouldn't need to be. Most shops are still separate loaded areas, and elevators still fade to black rather than moving up and down. So if you really hate those brief loading screens between areas, then this isn't going to win you over, and frankly, I don't think that that aspect of Starfield is ever going to change. But if you explore Varun Kai on foot or in the Rev 8, you will definitely have an experience which is more comparable to previous Bethesda open world games and less like the default Starfield experience. Bethesda have crafted a reasonably large square-shaped map surrounding the House Varun capital city, and it results in a planet surface which does feel more realistically populated and well thought out than Jemison or Aquila. When looking at the surface map, it doesn't seem especially well integrated into the surrounding area, but on the ground it does feel more interesting to explore than any other planet. And once I had seen most of the map, it left me with that wonderful feeling that there was almost certainly something I had missed. Almost every location on this map fits into the bigger House Varun picture, even if only in a small way, and that definitely makes exploring them feel a lot more rewarding. And there is even some fun environmental storytelling between major locations. Don't expect much, but I did find some. This is still just a small segment of a huge planet map though, so you can go beyond the borders too, or land elsewhere on the planet to find the random, not so handcrafted locations and encounters you know to expect from Starfield. These random locations do seem to feature more Varun zealots than on average, but all the ones I found were generic buildings and not Varun specific, like in the area surrounding Dazra. As for the city of Dazra itself, it's closer in size to Sidonia rather than New Atlantis, but because of the fleshed out surrounding area, it definitely doesn't feel small. If the city hadn't been destroyed by a vortex explosion though, then it probably would have been closer to the scale of New Atlantis, so it's a shame that had to happen. Still though, at least this explains where everyone was supposed to be living here, unlike in Aquila City, where the minimal living quarters leads me to believe that its residents are either sleeping in the streets or trekking several miles through Ashta territory to reach their homes. Anyway, everything you'd expect from a major Starfield settlement can be found in Dazra. From shops with terrible inventory to bars with boisterous patrons, but the aesthetics and character of the city are very unique and contribute to a small open world square which is a joy to explore overall, even if it doesn't utilize its more unique features especially well.
No harm will come to you, on that you have my word. You even have my assurance that your compatriot here will also remain unharmed.
In many ways, the gameplay loop in Shattered Space feels just like it does in the base game. In Dazra, you'll pick up side quests by overhearing conversations just like in any other settlement. You'll regularly blast your way through hordes of enemy NPCs just like in plenty of other missions. And you'll collect weapons, junk and secrets just like you might on any planet in the settled systems. There are several gameplay twists in Shattered Space though, which vary from brilliant to not so great. Like I've mentioned already, the single planet focus does change the feel of gameplay by simultaneously shrinking the scope and accelerating the rhythm of quests. There have always been missions in Starfield which keep you on one planet, but when they all do that, you miss the intervals of space travel which add variety to the game. That said, some people will definitely prefer this, and many won't even find it that noticeable. This isn't, after all, a particularly huge expansion. You could probably finish the main quest in under 5 hours if you wanted to, and you could see most of what the planet has to offer in 10 hours or closer to 15 if you take your time to explore the whole map. Beyond its single planet selling point, Shattered Space was also billed as offering more close quarters survival horror-esque combat than in the base game. And while I do think that's an interesting twist, it doesn't really ring true for most of the expansion's content. The majority of combat scenarios play out exactly as you'd expect, with a combination of outdoor jetpack boosting shooting gallery fun and tighter FPS action as you weave through corridors and caverns in interiors. The Vortex horrors and their Varun friends do pop up out of nowhere suddenly, and they will chase you around, but having a jetpack to boost yourself up into the air means they're rarely terrifying. Though certainly it is harder to predict where there's a fight incoming when Vortex enemies can randomly appear. There is one location with an associated small quest which does live up to the promise of horror, and it probably ended up being my favourite place in the DLC overall, so I won't spoil it any further here. It still wasn't full-on horror, but it was definitely scarier and atmospheric in a new way, so it's a shame there wasn't more like it. Another one of Shattered Space's unique selling points, gameplay-wise, was the presence of these anti-gravity bubbles, hazy blue pockets which let the player float around the world in a unique new way. These are incredibly fun to traverse and almost feel like a whole new platforming mechanic in the game, as you have to carefully time your jumps to reach hidden areas. The trouble is, though, that these blue bubbles are localized almost exclusively around the scaled citadel at the center of the map, and unless you choose to spend your whole time exploring this mostly empty area rather than finishing quests, you will spend barely any time navigating these anti-gravity bubbles, and that is very unfortunate for obvious reasons. The new weapons you can find on Varun Kai also give the player new ways to approach combat, and while none of them feel game-changing, because frankly Starfield did not underdeliver when it came to weapon variety in the first place, they are something a little different. Weirdly though, most of the cool new legendary variants I found in this DLC were for pre-existing weapons. Probably the most interesting new weapon addition is the extensively customizable Varun sword thing, which felt like it was more useful and powerful here than in the base game, where choosing melee always seemed like a bad choice. For fans of explosions, there are also some wacky new grenades, which are exclusively craftable at industrial workbenches. These have several variations, though they all felt similar in practice to me. I'm not a big grenade user normally, so I didn't utilize these much beyond initial testing, but even if I did love grenades, I think that the crafting process would put me off. You have to collect vortex shards and several other materials from vortex creatures, which means they're only really a good option on this single planet, and you have to find an industrial workbench anytime you want to make more grenades. It just seems like they're probably more effort than they're worth. Ultimately though, I think there is a good amount of new weapons and armor to be found on Varun Kai, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to test this gear out as you attempt to save House Varun from their little vortex explosion problem.
Then enter, and I shall guide you along the Serpent's path. For this is a journey you must undertake alone. Your escort cannot follow.
House Varun played a very small role in Starfield's base game, both within the main story and in side quests. But nonetheless, this interstellar religious cult founded by a man who apparently met a giant space snake was always one of the most compelling aspects of the game's world building. Though maybe that was in large part because of how little we learnt about them. There was always an inherent risk then in exposing all the gory details of House Faroon's existence in their own dedicated story expansion. Because a faction defined by secrecy and mystery loses much of its charm when it's no longer very secret or mysterious. It might not be surprising to learn then that Shattered Space and the story it tells doesn't always do a great job of presenting House Faroon to the player, and rarely does things the way you probably would have expected. When the rest of the game tells you that no outsiders are allowed on the House Faroon homeworld, it's a bit weird how quickly they welcome you into their society, and essentially allow you to become one of them. When, in the rest of the game, this faction is sold as cunning, merciless, and hopelessly devoted to a space snake, it's a little bit disappointing to find that most of their people are just regular folk, who are remarkably stoic considering that they're living through the aftermath of a cataclysmic event. When their society has been described as full of strange customs and occult traditions, it's downright odd to learn that they did at one point welcome a Chunks restaurant onto Varun Kai. I definitely need to mention too that I brought Andrasia along with me for the whole DLC and was pretty disappointed with how she fits in here, because she barely does really. She makes the normal amount of comments in dialogue, as I suspect all the companions do, and that's not an insignificant amount, but it doesn't feel nearly substantial enough given how she talks about House Faroon in her follower quest and in general dialogue in the base game. She doesn't even seem particularly concerned to learn that half of Dazra has exploded. I know she's just one of the game's companions and a player could take any of the others, but I really feel like she deserved a lot more attention. And even a single short quest where Andrasia got to visit a familiar place and reminisce would have gone a very long way. As it stands, she seems very casual about visiting her homeworld in the midst of a crisis, and it feels a bit weird. Shattered Space's main story deals simultaneously with the experiment gone wrong at the heart of Dazra, and the conflict between the three houses vying for control over the faction. The vortex explosion in the Scaled Citadel is an interesting starting point, which also felt like it was going to tie in to Starfield's pre-existing cosmic magic lore in some way. But in the end, it never really did, and the vortex stuff ultimately raised more questions than it ever answered. I still enjoyed learning about the events leading up to this catastrophic event and attempting to find a solution, but the story never fully satiated my thirst for celestial knowledge. At the same time, dealing with the competing houses of House Faroon started off very compelling and offered up some fun quests, but ultimately came to very little. You basically deal with these three houses separately for most of the game, and so there's very little actual competition going on. I won't go into too much detail on these houses to avoid spoiling the specifics of their individual stories, but suffice it to say that they also don't do a very good job of differentiating themselves. I think that they're meant to represent the different tenets of House Faroon's faith, but it's not made especially obvious, and I can't help but wish that they had really leaned into extremes by making one house into sadistic evil psychos, one into a bunch of creepy weirdos, and one into a group of aloof spiritualists. The Zealots, who are the largest Faroon presence in the base game, also make an appearance here, but are not really a part of the central conflict. You can basically consider them to be the raiders or bandits on Varun Kai, along with some deserted spacers for some reason, who, for better or worse, you don't have options to side with. In the end, Shattered Space doesn't offer the player any particularly meaningful choices, nor does its story have several varied outcomes. unfortunately. Many players were hopeful that this DLC being entirely self-contained would allow it to tell a story with a lot more possible endings than most of the quests in the base game. But it's mostly a very linear journey in the end. In fact, it felt like the story was taking such a singular path that I started to wonder whether it was doing so chiefly because Bethesda were planning to continue House Va'ruun's story with a future DLC and didn't want to overcomplicate things for themselves. But then, weirdly, the story ends by giving you a couple of choices which would seem to have enormous consequences for the future of the faction. Story-wise, they are massive decisions, but they don't feel especially meaningful when you know you aren't going to see the consequences. Ultimately, the expansion story is a nice complement to the other faction questlines featured in the game, as a self-contained series of missions which makes the player the center of attention in a single conflict. Compared to the other factions then, I think House Va'ruun's story comes out looking good, but not great. I think it has a slight edge over the Freestar Rangers questline for me, because it feels more substantial and has a proper definitive end, but I think I probably prefer the Ryujin questline just for the types of quests it sends you on. I think the Crimson Fleet questline offers better, more interesting choices to the player, and the Vanguard questline remains my personal firm favourite. How you feel about each will come down to personal preference, but I can't imagine that this Va'ruun story will end up at the top of the list for most people.
As much as I'd welcome the expertise, the Zealots would never allow an outsider to participate.
One of Starfield's greatest strengths, in my opinion, is that there is so much varied content on offer that a player can choose to ignore huge portions of the game and have a great time focusing on just the stuff that they enjoy most. As I've said before, I think it does a bad job explaining itself to players, and I understand why its clunky presentation puts some people off, but it's a lot of fun once you understand what Starfield is. Shattered Space, then, to me, is a good addition to the game's vast universe of options, even if it feels at times like it wants to be its own separate experience, rather than playing along happily with everything else in Starfield. I had a lot of questions about House Va'ruun going into Shattered Space, and while many of them were answered, sometimes in unsatisfying ways, a lot of them definitely were not, and I've been left with many more new questions too. So at the end of it all, I'm left hoping that we're not done with House Va'ruun just yet, and there are even more secrets left to uncover in the future. Either way, I thoroughly enjoyed my time on Va'ruun Kai, and although it might not be my favourite planet in the game, it could end up being yours. If you've had a chance to check out Shattered Space, then let me know what you thought of it in the comments. And please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. And if you happen to like this t-shirt inspired by Neon and the Chasm Bass, then you'll find it linked below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.